Hey everyone, this episode of The Vinyl Guide is sponsored in part by our friends at Groove Washer. Let Groove Washer clean and protect your vinyl with record cleaners, stylus brushes, protective sleeves, and more. Great holiday gifts for record nerds are available at groovewasher.com. Also, we are sponsored by AudiophileuSA.com. Over 42,000 titles in stock, all near mint and excellent condition. Dig, search, and find the gold at AudiophileuSA.com. And now, on with the show. Well, hey everyone, it's Nate. Welcome to episode 311 of The Vinyl Guide, the podcast for record collectors and music nerds. And today you're all in for a real treat. Joining us will be Bruce Spizer, Beatles historian, author of multiple books on the Beatles universe, and one of the top authorities on collectible Beatles records. Bruce has several books available at Beatles.net, all of which are stunningly great, including The Beatles Finally Let It Be, a book all about the Beatles in the twilight of their collective creativity and the story of what became Let It Be. Now today we talked to Bruce about that story, the Beatles at Twickenham, the film crew, the Nagra reels, the Let It Be bootlegs, some of them even spawned by the Beatles themselves. Bruce and I talk about the pressings of Let It Be, the booklets from 1970, the 2021 box set, even the film Let It Be, and the upcoming Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson. Beatles fans and music nerds rejoice. I think you're all going to enjoy our chat today with Bruce. And by the way, if you want to learn more about Bruce and his Beatles books, I suggest going to Beatle.net. There, Bruce has dang near a dozen books, each one focused on a special Beatles release or time in their career. For example, there's a book all on the White Album and the launch of Apple. There's a book on Sgt. Pepper. There's one book that focuses exclusively on the Beatles on the VJ label, and many more. Each of these books is beautifully laid out with high-res images of record labels and sleeves that allow any collector, newbie or experienced, to quickly understand which version or pressing they own. There are hard copies of Bruce's books, which you could order from Beatle.net. There are also digital PDF copies that enjoy occasional updates as well. Now, I can't recommend Bruce's books highly enough. They are fantastic. Just check them out for yourself at Beatle.net. And finally, if you're a Beatles fanatic and you want to hear more tales of the Fab Four on vinyl, we have many episodes of the Vinyl Guide podcast, which you can hear anytime by simply following our podcast on your podcast app. Episodes like episode 258, The Business of Beatles Vinyl with Andrew Milton of Parlogram Auctions, episode 222, The Story of the Beatles Butcher Cover, Episode 179, The Story of Abbey Road. Episode 146, The Story of the Beatles' White Album and the launch of Apple. Episode 141, our interview with Klaus Vormann. And even Episode 57, The Story of John Lennon's personal copy of the Beatles' Butcher Cover. All of these episodes and hundreds more are available anytime by simply following and subscribing to the Vinyl Guide podcast. All right, that's it for the upfronts. Let's talk about how the Beatles finally let it be with Beatles historian and author Bruce Spizer. Bruce, again, thank you so much for coming back on the show. And
Glad to do it.
These episodes and discussions that we have are always some fan favorites. And, you know, 'tis the season for Let It Be. And I found myself revisiting this record. I've never really paid a whole lot of attention to this record. And I've found in recent weeks, especially I got the box set of the vinyl.
Yeah.
I am really enjoying it, probably for the first time, hearing it with brand new ears.
Yeah. I think there's something to that. And yeah, part of the problem with Let It Be for someone my age was the circumstances of when it came out. That prior to the album coming out, of course, I had heard the Get Back single, which I absolutely loved. I'd heard the Let It Be single, which I absolutely loved. And I had heard many of the Get Back recordings on a bootleg. And so imagine my shock when I go to the record store and see the Long and Winding Road 45, and I listened to it at the record store, didn't buy it because I knew it would be on the album. And to my horror, heard Long and Winding Road with all of these strings. And I remember it as a beautiful, simple piano ballad. And all of a sudden it was like, what has Phil Spector done to this song? And so that kind of was a problem going into the album. Plus, the Beatles had broken up, and that was a bit of a bummer having that information. And so, you're kind of in the situation where you're not really feeling warm and fuzzy about the album to begin with. And then, you put it on the turntable and, oh my God, Two of Us sounds great. And now we've got some stuff from the Rooftop and that sounds great, but I'd already heard Across the Universe. And why do I have this muddy sounding choir and instrumental, strings going on? And then Let It Be, what did he do to Let It Be? Why is this brass so loud? It's drowning out poor Paul's voice. And then, of course, Long and Winding Road didn't sound any better on LP than it did on 45. So I had very mixed feelings about the album. I loved about half of it and hated a couple, probably more than half of it I loved. But I hated what Spector did to a handful of the tracks.
So I do want to talk about the bootlegs and that how that worked, because that plays a large role into it. But before we do, let's set it up. The Beatles going into Let It Be, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that period of time was really chaotic for them. They weren't in the best frame of mind. I understand John was, on heroin or coming off of heroin. And organizationally, it seems the Beatles were pretty disorganized and rudderless at this time. Apple was starting to crumble. Is that right?
There was no Brian Epstein. And, when people say, why did the Beatles break up? I think, it's not like Yoko sat on George's amp or ate George's biscuit and she got, and George got upset and quit the group, never to want to be friends again. Look, was John's time with Yoko an effect on it? Of course, because John was more interested in spending time with Yoko than being a Beatle. But I don't think it's fair to lay the blame on Yoko. I think when Brian died, John knew they were in trouble. And as he famously told Alistair Taylor, who was kind of like a fix-it man for Brian Epstein, and I can say this word because it won't be a curse word with a British accent, but basically he said we fucking had it. And John knew there was trouble. Paul tried to fill the void by taking over and being in charge, and that was resented by George, certainly, and John to a certain extent as well. And so the dynamics were certainly trouble-bound. The sessions themselves really started with something totally different. Paul had really enjoyed the Hey Jude Revolution filming of promotional videos at Twickenham Film Studios. Michael Lindsay Hogg had handled it. Mal had gone out in the streets and brought an audience to come in, and you had people in, even though they were just singing live and they were playing over recorded tracks on the instruments, it gave the band a rush of, hey, we perform live in front of an audience. And that was really a wonderful experience. And Paul's idea was, look, we should do this again. We could do a concert, maybe at the Royal Albert Hall, where we would play some of the songs from our new album we're working on, meaning the White Album, and some rock and roll oldies. And that's what we'll do. And we'll do that by the end of the year. And that was the concept. And then he got the idea, we would obviously want the concert film, but we could rehearse for this concert and have those rehearsals filmed. And then the idea became, look, rather than just doing songs that people already know, we could do something really different, and we could actually learn some new songs, and we could rehearse these new songs that would be part of the show. And then Dennis O'Dell got the idea of, okay, look, we can do this at Twickenham Film Studios. I've got the studio booked in February for the Magic Christian, and the Beatles could go in there and could do these rehearsals at Twickenham. We could film it there. And, and that was kind of the way it all evolved. So on January 2nd, the Beatles show up at Twickenham Film Studios. They're used not to recording in the morning. They're used to recording late afternoon and into all hours of the night and early morning. And here they are at Twickenham. It was a very sterile environment compared to, Abbey Road, which was a fairly small studio that they had grown quite attached to over the years. Paul had a batch of great songs. John, not so much. He had a couple of songs, but not much. George had a bunch of great songs, but how many were the Beatles going to let him really spend time on? And so, these were kind of the issues they were facing going in. So it wasn't surprising that things did become kind of unraveled and chaotic at times.
At this point, was Allen Klein in the picture?
Well, I think Klein was in the picture here. And what Klein had done, and a very positive thing, was originally Get Back was going to be a TV special. Mm-hmm. And Klein later on tells them, let's make it a movie. So is Klein involved in this point? No, not really. So I think to answer your question, I'm thinking more of the album. Mm-hmm. As far as these sessions themselves, no, Klein is not really involved in these sessions per se. His involvement becomes very heavy-handed, but at a later time.
At this point in time, the state of Apple, as we've covered in a past episode, and of course in your book on the White Album and Apple Records, is Apple as an organization in trouble? Were the Beatles in any sort of financial straits at that point?
I mean, Apple is heading in that direction, clearly. Mm-hmm. And John kind of senses it. From a creative standpoint, Apple is still in great shape. They've given you, their first four, Hey Jude, Mary Hopkin, Jackie Lomax's Sour Milk Sea, and, the Yellow Submarine, Thingamabob, produced by Paul with the brass band. In addition to that, they've got this James Taylor album that's going to be coming out. They've got the White Album. I mean, Apple is doing great. Paul is heavily involved in Apple at this time, mm-hmm. as is George. And so Apple is doing just fine. And they're going to be doing this, TV special, Get Back, as it's going to be called. But, the initial sessions start out on a rocky road. And, by January 10th, this is a little over a week, George gets fed up and he quits the band. Now, I know a lot of people, when you see the film Let It Be, it appears that, it's Paul and George having their troubles. And George says, very famously, I'll play or I won't play at all. Whatever it is to please you, I'll do it. That wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that George was fed up with John's lack of communicating with them. John's way of communicating was letting Yoko do the talking for him. And George was very frustrated with that. He didn't feel he was getting respect with the songs that he was trying to get the group interested in. And, right around lunchtime on, Friday, January 10th says, I'm quitting the band. And John asks when, and he says now, and, and walks out. And that's that. And then the group tries to soldier on without him with pretty horrible results. And they have a few meetings, and George says, look, I'll come back, but under the following conditions. One, no more Twickenham. We use our studio at Apple that Magic Alex has been putting together for us. And no concert. We'll just record a new album. And so that's the plan. And they go to Apple. And, bear in mind at Twickenham, these were not proper recordings. We have recordings of Twickenham, but these were from the recorders used by the film production company, the so-called Nagra reels. And they're fascinating, but they're not intended to be issued as recordings, although, of course, they've been bootlegged, and some of them did make it onto the super deluxe edition of Let It Be. But, I've listened to all 83 hours of that, and look, it's not all bloody hell. There are some really fine moments, and there are times when they're really enjoying themselves. But also, let's be honest, George quit the group during those sessions, so it wasn't all love and kisses.
Is George's quitting of the band, is that on video or a Nagra reel? Can you hear that?
It's certainly on a Nagra reel, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you actually hear him saying, I'm quitting the band, and John says when, and George says now. And he says words to the effect of, he doesn't say see you around the clubs, which is widely reported. If he does say that, it's not on the Nagra reels. What he actually says is call the NME, meaning New Musical Express, a music magazine, and get a few replacements. That's what he actually says.
Now, going into Twickenham, Paul brought a batch of songs.
Yeah.
George brought a few. John sounds like he really wasn't prepared. What was the state of John Lennon at this time?
I think you're right. John was heavily involved in drugs. Heroin. We know he was heavily involved with Yoko.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think John, to him, it was, okay, well, I've got some songs I want to do. Don't Let Me Down. And they spend a lot of time on it. And Paul makes some very good contributions to Don't Let Me Down. John also resurrects certain things. He has Dig a Pony, which is kind of a cool song. He has worked on I've Got a Feeling with Paul, and his part of it, the Everybody Had a Hard Year stuff, is great, and they mesh the two songs together. That works really well. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, John thinks that Across the Universe can be bettered, and of course it can't. The version they recorded before going off to India for Transcendental Meditation that was recorded in February of 1968 was wonderful. And every attempt they did at Let It Be is just horrible.
What did he think was missing out of the original?
I don't know. I mean, you listen to it, it's a fabulous song. And John was sometimes his harshest critic. I mean, I think if John had said that's the single, that would have been the A-side and Lady Madonna would have been the B-side. But John didn't want to release it because he just felt it wasn't right. And instead, they take this heavy-handed approach, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Look, to me personally, I think Across the Universe is probably one of my favorite moments of all the Beatles recordings. I absolutely love it. Maybe John was thinking similarly, and he wanted to have the ultimate recording of what he felt was his ultimate song. That's how I've read it.
Yeah, but all he had to do was listen to the song and realize it's absolutely gorgeous the way it is. And if he didn't like that particular take, some of the earlier takes are beautiful and simplistic. I mean, just a great song that John in his life never really fully appreciated how great it was, or how great the recordings were. You know?
So let's focus real quickly on the Nagra reels, because the Nagra reels, as I understand it, these are tapes that are constantly recording everything that's happening in Twickenham, which over the course...
And Apple Studios as well.
Okay, so they were running in both locations.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's just at Apple, we also had the 8 tracks.
Got it. Okay. Of these Nagra reels, you said there's 85 hours or something like that?
About 83, 85 hours. Yeah.
Okay. And they're constantly picking up things, not just band rehearsals and chatter, but, coffee breaks, people walking around, every moment that the Beatles were in that month, really.
After George quits the band on the tapes, you can hear his footsteps as he walks out the studio.
Okay. Now, as I understand it, those tapes, those Nagra reels, those went missing for a while. Is that right?
Well, they were in the possession of bootleggers for a while. And then Apple eventually gained possession of them.
But the actual tapes, did they disappear? Someone in the film company put them somewhere or took them home? Or
somebody took them, and bootleggers ended up when they were probably sold to bootleggers.
I thought I recall a news report in the last 10 years where some or all of them were recovered. Is that right?
Yes, they were recovered and turned over to Apple.
Okay. All right. So the original tapes disappeared from the film production crew, or at some point they disappeared.
Ended up in the hands of bootleggers, and then Apple got them back.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the bootlegging of those Nagra reels. That's quite fascinating. Early on, obviously, there was no way to distribute 83 hours of material in the early 70s. How did people go over them selectively? How did they move around?
I think let's go with the history of the bootlegs, because it's kind of convoluted. Where it really starts, as far as from a public standpoint, is there was a Canadian journalist who John was friends with. He had interviewed John when John was in Canada. And while John's in England, this Canadian journalist is over there. And what happens is that John is sitting in his office. He's over there to interview George and drops by to say hello to John and Yoko, who he had met. And while he's there, a producer of a rock show that they're about to put on, this rock and roll revival show, calls. And John takes a call and's talking to him and asks the journalist, is this guy on the up and up? And he says, yeah. And John and Yoko get the idea to do this, event, Plastic Ono Band at the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival, and comes back and he's really happy he did the event. And the Canadian reporter drops back again that at that point in time, apparently John gave him an acetate that Glenn Johns had made of some of the Get Back recordings. And so, basically it's kind of like an acetate, a rough mix of the album itself, although it will be cleaned up a little bit. So it wasn't the final Get Back album, but pretty close. And the Canadian journalist takes this back with him and apparently decides that, I can help out, one of my buddies at this Toronto radio station and make some money at the same time. And so they air the songs and, people tape those songs off the air and some guy sells it to some Buffalo station in Buffalo, New York, and they air it. So news of that comes out to the West Coast. Not West Coast, I take that back to Boston, where a disc jockey who was on the West Coast and relocated to Boston, now all of a sudden he hears that and he says, wait a minute, I've got tapes of these sessions that are pretty high quality that I've never played before because I didn't think it would be appropriate for me to play them. But now that the cat's out of the bag, I'm going to play them. And he thinks they're the same recordings, but they're actually not. They're higher quality, but they're slightly different recordings. Some of them are the same, but it's not a Get Back album. It's an acetate that Glenn Johns had made. And these tapes have been given over to Derek Taylor, their PR person in LA. Derek Taylor gives it to Tom Donahue, who's a disc jockey, FM disc jockey on the West Coast. And Donahue gives it to a friend of his who goes and ends up in Boston. And so anyway, what you have is different recordings getting played on the radio. Bootleggers basically tape them off the radio, and they start putting out these bootlegs, and they come out toward the end of 1969.
So the band and their organization they were the leaks.
Yeah.
John Lennon.
John was the one who really started it, yeah. Inadvertently, it's John being naive, felt I'll give it to this guy, he'll listen to it, and nothing will ever happen.
Okay. And then people, I imagine, started taping it off the radio. Were the bootlegs largely just those two sources at that time?
Yes, they were. And then later on, after the album comes out, in the next year or two, we start having some of the Nagra tapes sort of leak out. And so the mother load's not there, but some of these recordings start coming out on bootlegs. There's a double album set called Sweet Apple Tracks, and other ones start coming out. And that's when, people start listening to them, and the quality's pretty bad. The playing is, quite frankly, on many of the songs pretty bad. But people realize it's out there. And as time marches on forward, the quality gets better. And then by the time we get to the CD age, you have some really high quality box sets coming out of these, from these tapes. And the sound quality is pretty darn good, but you can't make the performances any better. They are what they are. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the performances are quite good. Depends on what you're listening to.
Now, you just shared with us this movement of recordings, and we understand people's names and how they got connected in there. Do we know much about the life of the Nagra reels from the time they disappeared out of the film studio?
No, as I've said, they just miraculously ended up at some point in the hands of the bootleggers.
Got it.
And as I've said, I'm sure money was involved.
So let's talk a little bit about how the bootlegs impacted the album, because with all those bootlegs circulating and those pre-issue tracks being heard around, did that play a key role in why what was going to be the Get Back album got put on hold and eventually became packaged as Let It Be?
No, I think what really happened there was Glenn Johns had this idea, let's do an honest, fun Beatles album. And let's take some performances that are fun. You can tell the Beatles are joking around. They're saying cool stuff. and we're going to make that the album. And John and Paul and George and Ringo were never totally sold on that concept. When he first broached them with the idea in late January and played them an acetate of some of the songs to give a feeling of what it would be like, they were like, no, we don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And then, they started, the idea originally was, we've got maybe 6, 7, 8 songs that are in pretty good shape. We'll record some more, maybe fix up some of those, and we'll have an album. That was the original plan. But as they started doing it, they started shifting to, maybe we just should record a new album and let's let Glyn Johns do what he wanted to do. And so they kind of move on toward that. And Glyn Johns puts together the Get Back album. The problem with the Get Back album, and when you listen to it either on bootleg or now you can listen to it as part of the super deluxe edition of the Let It Be album that has recently come out, you take a song like One After 909, sounds great on the Glyn Johns Get Back album, sounds great on the Let It Be album. It's the same performance, rooftop performance. But if you take Dig a Pony and I've Got a Feeling, Glyn Johns takes 2 early takes of those, very early takes of those, that aren't that good. I've Got a Feeling the song breaks down before the best part of the song. When John and Paul are singing the counterparts of Everybody Had a Hard Year and Paul singing I've Got a Feeling, you miss that. Not a good performance. 2 of us, Glyn Johns takes an early performance of it, which is kind of slow and plodding, rather than the one Spector used, which was for January 31, which was by then the Beatles have that song nailed. It's the most upbeat take of the song and the best. So, Glyn Johns, bad move on his part there. Long and Winding Road. Once again, I'd say a January, 26 performance. The group's kind of feeling their way through the song at that point. And they went ahead and did the song once again on January 31. Much better performance. So part of the problem is they're just not the group's best performances. They sound amateurish. Yes, they're honest, but they're not the Beatles' best takes of these songs. Mal Evans described them as, the Beatles with their socks off. Well, yeah, that's all good and well, but when you take your socks off, generally your feet smell funny. So generally, not the best performances. Warts and all, yes, once again, but do you really want to look at somebody's warts? No, you don't. So, that was the problem. And I think that because they were never fully satisfied with the album, it was getting delayed, but also they did not want the album to come out until the TV special was ready, because they were going to tell people, this is like the soundtrack of this TV show. It's not our next Sgt. Pepper. It's not our next White Album. It's not a proper album. And that's what Abbey Road would be, a proper album. And then it was, okay, well, we're going to have the movie and, we'll do it as a movie soundtrack. But still, once again, John and George were not completely satisfied with the album as it turned out. Paul probably wasn't either. So what changes everything is Allen Klein. Allen Klein comes in and says, look, this should not be a TV special. It should be a film. So now they've got to, rather than it being a 60-minute TV show, now it's going to be a 90-minute movie. So that delays things. And then Klein also was thinking, they've already put out Abbey Road, which is their most polished album. And now they're going to go to this amateurish sounding Get Back album. And he doesn't particularly like it. And the other significant thing is that John has a song that he's just written in early January, Instant Karma. And he calls up George, hey, will you play on the song? George says, yeah. Hey, I heard Phil Spector was in town. Let's get Phil to produce it. So Phil comes in, produces the session. It's a fun session. Everyone loves the results. And John and George invite Phil Spector to say, hey, Phil, we got these tapes from this album called Get Back. We want you to work your magic on it. And they turn it over to Phil. And Phil begins mixing it. And he's doing a pretty good job on it. And then Phil gets this idea of, I think some of these tracks need orchestration. And so on April Fool's Day, 1970, he gets together a big orchestra at Abbey Road And it's kind of an insane session where Phil's going off the deep end and Ringo kind of has to talk him back down. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's kind of what happens. Spector puts this album together. John and George hear it and love it. Paul hears it and doesn't really like Long and Winding Road. But by then, things are moving along too late and the album comes out. Paul's not happy with Long and Winding Road. George Martin is horrified by it. And there it is. Let It Be, as reproduced by disc by Phil Spector.
Now, with Allen Klein in the picture, there seems to be a lot of focus on things like, there was the Hey Jude or Beatles Again album.
Yeah, let's make some money.
Film. Yeah, okay. And again, that motion always led me to the assumption that the Beatles may have been struggling at this point because they dumped a lot of money into Apple. It has its moments, but it was also a bit of a vanity project.
Yeah.
Understanding the Rolling Stones lost quite a bit getting aligned with Allen Klein. In an alternative universe, if it played out a little bit longer, is it possible the same thing could have happened with the Beatles?
We'll be back after these messages.
Hey there, I gotta tell you about the Groove Washer. Not because I have to, but because I want to. The Groove Washer is the best record cleaner you can get. And if you have a vinyl collection, you need to keep it clean. Dirt and dust lead to groove wear, which affects the sound and value of your record collection. Use the Groove Washer to clean before each play, and your ears and future pocketbook will thank you. Ask for the Groove Washer by name at your local record store or go direct to groovewasher.com and use promo code VinylGuide10 at checkout. Groove Washer is a great holiday gift. Why not send one to a friend? groovewasher.com, discount code VinylGuide10. Do it now. And all record nerds want to hear about AudiofileUSA.com, the family-owned and operated online record shop that's been in business over 30 trustworthy years. AudiofileUSA.com only sells excellent and near-mint vinyl records, only in tip-top quality for your turntable. And with over 42,000 titles, you're sure to find a bunch on your want list at AudiofileUSA.com. Audiophile vinyl is not just for the elite. Everyone can enjoy the gold standard of sound at AudiofileUSA.com. Search by title, genre, label, dig and find the deals at AudiofileUSA.com, home of the Holy Grails.
Now we return to the program already in progress.
No limits. Understanding the Rolling Stones lost quite a bit getting aligned with Allen Klein. In an alternative universe, if it played out a little bit longer, is it possible the same thing could have happened with the Beatles?
Well, I think that there was no way that once Klein was in, that things were going to deteriorate because Paul was being advised by Linda's in-laws, the Eastmans. Mm-hmm. And Paul's in-law, soon-to-be in-laws, the Eastmans. So John Eastman, basically Klein has a lousy reputation in New York City. And the Eastmans are based in New York City, and they don't want to work with Klein, and they're concerned about Klein. And because of this infighting between the Eastmans and Klein, that's how they lose the publishing. They had a chance to get their publishing from, Dick James, and they essentially blow it over infighting, which is really tragic. But one of the things Klein does well is he does get them a new record deal, and the new record deal gets them a much higher royalty rate. So Klein does some good, but he also does some bad. And I think that if they had had somebody kind of working with the Eastmans and with Klein, if there was another party to come in and try to mediate all this mess, maybe, just maybe, it could have worked. Mm-hmm. But it was a recipe for disaster with very strong, well-willed people with the Eastmans and Klein. And it was basically Eastman versus Klein, Paul versus John, George, and Ringo. That was a recipe for a breakup.
I saw that picture of all four of them with Allen Klein. Three of them are happy, and Paul's giving the thumbs down sign with the frown.
Yeah, you can tell Paul's not.
Can we talk a little bit about the publishing, the arc of what happened there and how they lost it?
Well, it was fairly complex. It was that, it was up for the taking to be sold, and the problem was that if John and Paul could have gotten their act together and put forward a good, solid offer, then I think, all things considered, people would have preferred to have sold it to them. It was their work, but they had a cash flow problem. Klein had, during these negotiations, managed to put a freeze, and he was challenging royalties and things. And basically, EMI said, screw it, and weren't paying them royalties for a while. There was a cash crunch. And then also, I think, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think that that Paul understood what the publishing was worth, but that John and Yoko, not so much. In the amount that was being offered, they didn't offer enough. Mm-hmm. That if they had offered more, they might have been able to get it. I think the infighting was the end where, because they couldn't get their act together, the sellers just thought, screw it. We'll just sell it to ATV for a bunch of money and be done with this. The hell with their infighting. They can't get their act together. I think the bottom line was, between Eastman and Klein, they didn't get their act together. And I think that's where the blame should be placed. Not entirely on Allen Klein, not entirely on Eastman, but the two of them together, not getting their act together, I think cost them the publishing.
Mm-hmm. And how much was the publishing sold for at that point?
I don't remember the exact figures off the top of my head. I'd have to get out a book and read it in a book. I don't want to pull a number out. It was a bargain compared to what it's worth today.
Yeah,
let's put it that way.
Yeah, right now it's like 1.2 billion or something.
And the irony of it was Paul and Eastman understood the value of the publishing. Mm-hmm. Yet they still allowed this to happen.
Okay, so the Beatles, they moved from Twickenham to, is it Abbey Road, or did they move to Apple?
The basement and Apple.
So their Magic Alex had been preparing this studio.
Yeah, this great studio that was a disaster. And so basically what they have to do is tear out what he has done and have George Martin bring over some stuff from EMI Studios. Mm-hmm. So he brings the mobile units from EMI, and now they have a workable studio. And George Martin's involvement at Twickenham, he was there not every day, but he was there for some of it. And Glenn Johns was doing not just balance, not just the balance engineer, but also, acting sort of as an unofficial producer at times. Mm-hmm. When they get to Apple, George Martin's involvement becomes much more, because now they're going to be making proper recordings. And George Martin is much more involved at Apple.
Why was Glenn Johns considered for leading more of the Twickenham production when the Beatles had this whole history with George Martin up to that point?
Well, once again, they weren't recording. They were rehearsing at Twickenham. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so Glenn Johns was brought in as a balance engineer. And Paul and John had met him probably through the Stones, because they had actually participated in the Stones single, We Love You, and I believe the flip side as well, Dandelion. So for that reason, they had met him and they had heard some good things about him. So they just decided, okay, well, we'll bring him along over to Twickenham. And that's how that happened. It wasn't that, we don't want to use George Martin, and maybe they thought, well, maybe we're getting a little bit away from him. But, once they get to Apple, George Martin is definitely there on a good deal of those recordings. And he's definitely producer. He's definitely in charge.
So from what I understand at the time, that change over from Twickenham to Apple Studios, that really made like a seismic change on the way the group was working together. Yeah.
And one of the things that really, it's not just being at Apple that helps the environment. George, while he was playing hooky, he and Eric Clapton went to see Ray Charles, and in his band was Billy Preston, who they had met before when he was backing Little Richard in the Hamburg days. So George talks to Billy and says, look, you should come by Apple. Billy comes by Apple, and George goes up and brings him down to the studio. And basically, John says, hey, you want a gig? You want to play on an album? Normally we would overdub the keyboards ourselves, but we want to do everything live. So you'll be playing keyboards. And of course, Billy's all excited. Well, now think about it. If you've got a little bit of tense family discussions and company comes by, you generally act better. Billy Preston was like company to them. He wasn't the Abbey Road crew. He wasn't the usual engineers. He wasn't George Martin. He wasn't family. He was a guest. And so their behavior becomes better because Billy Preston's there. Plus, he makes the music better because, their idea is they don't want to overdub things for this album. And now you've got songs where having that extra keyboard really fills out and gives everything a fuller, sound.
So Let It Be is recorded. The basic tracks are recorded. The Beatles go on to break up, or the breakup is announced. How much in advance before the release of Let It Be did the world know that the Beatles were no longer playing together?
Yeah, about a month, because Paul puts out his McCartney album, and that's when the news breaks. To help publicize the album, Paul puts out this interview, and in the interview, he essentially says he's leaving the Beatles. Even though John, several months earlier, after the completion of Abbey Road, said, look, I'm leaving the band. So John, in his mind, is done with the Beatles. Maybe they'll get back together and record again. Who knows? But as far as John's concerned, he's left the Beatles. And so, Paul announces he's quitting. Now, ironically, recently, Paul wants the world to know, hey, I'm not the bad guy who broke up the Beatles. John quit the Beatles before I did. And the media jumps on this as this exciting new news when Rolling Stone had an interview with John not that far after Paul's album came out, where John says, oh, it's the old cartoon. There's this guy standing there by himself saying, I'm leaving. In other words, John had said he was leaving the Beatles and the others have pretty much accepted it. And all of a sudden now Paul says, hey, I'm leaving the Beatles. So, to me, this is like, why is this news? Well, I guess it's news, but it's not new news. We knew it all along.
Right. Okay. So everyone who purchased a copy of Let It Be knew it was it was the end. They already knew that. Yes. This was just the end artifact, which to me always, the album is black. It seems very somber. It's almost like an epitaph.
Well, those exact words are used by the British reviewers because, in the UK, it's not just a gatefold album, but it has this, big Get Back book with all these pictures and text. Mm-hmm. And when you read some of the text, you kind of hear about, you can see some of the issues from reading the text in there and see that they're arguing about things.
Right. Now, the UK version had, again, this box, this booklet, but the US version didn't.
No.
Why was any understanding as to why some regions got that big package and others didn't? Every
region got it except for, the US, really. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that Allen Klein and United Artists made a decision. And what Klein wanted to do, first of all, the Beatles, and this is an area that gets confusing. The Beatles had a contract with United Artists for 3 films and 2 soundtrack albums. A Hard Day's Night comes out. Film, soundtrack album, done. Help comes out. Film, soundtrack album, goes to Capitol. So at this point in time, the Beatles owe United Artists a film and a soundtrack album. Yellow Submarine comes along, and many people say, 3rd film. Wrong. United Artists. And I interviewed David Picker, who was head of United Artists at the time, said, no, what we told the Beatles was, look, we'll distribute the film for you, but you still owe us a film. So Allen Klein, when he reviews the contracts and his contract negotiations, is aware of the fact that the Beatles owe United Artists a film and a soundtrack album. So even though Capitol is planning on putting out the Get Back album and is all excited, hey, we get a new Beatles album, Klein comes in and says it's no longer a TV special, it's a film. We're giving the film to United Artists. David Picker of UA tells me, look, we took the documentary film because we knew there would never be another Help Hard Day's Night. So we took that, and we also wanted our soundtrack. So Klein, in all likelihood, goes to Capitol and says, look, you're not going to get this album. However, here's the good news. United Artists doesn't press their own records, and they're going to have you press the records. So you will make money from this album. You just won't be its distributor, and you won't make as much money. So that's how that plays out. So if you look at the label on it, it's a red apple. How did that happen? Alan Steckler, who worked for Allen Klein at APCO, thought it's a special album that should have a special colored apple label. Done. Doesn't mean it's red because United Artists logo is red. Doesn't mean it's red because the Beatles have broken up. It doesn't mean it's red because there were bloody fights among the Beatles. It just was red because Alan Steckler picked red, period. And that's in the U.S., the red label only in the U.S.
Oh, okay. It's not anywhere else in the world.
It's green elsewhere, yeah.
Okay. This box and this booklet, they seem very fragile.
Yes.
In fact, if you could find a copy these days that is in respectable shape, it'll command $500 or more.
Much more than that.
Yeah.
The problem is the booklet has a tendency to fall apart. It was cheaply bound with glue, and it just falls apart. It was not a sewn bound.
Who was doing? Was it Garrett and Lofthouse that was doing the manufacturing, or who was taking that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Garrett and Lofthouse did the booklet, but they did it on the cheap. When you can do a paperback that won't fall apart, but if you do glue, eventually it's going to fall apart. And this one fell apart pretty quick.
Okay.
My copy certainly did.
So you had an original copy. How did you?
Yeah, that's a fun story in itself.
Okay.
I got my original copy in the summer of 1970, months after it came out. My parents were going to East Africa. My dad was a doctor, and he was going to a medical convention in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. And I went along with them. And on the way to Nairobi, we had a layover in London for about 6 hours. We took a cab into town and asked the cabbie to drive us around and show us, Big Ben and the Tower of London and all the little highlights. And I said, I want to see Carnaby Street and I want to go to a record store. I went into a record store. I purchased a copy of the album. My parents pointed out that it was expensive. It was £3, which in those days was around $10 or more. Mm. And I said, yes, but I want it. And they said, you'll have to lug it around Africa. And I said, I'm willing to do that. This will be my birthday present. My parents said, fine. And they bought it for me. Well, when I brought it home and played it only once or twice, it sounded fine, but so did the US album. And it was on the Parlophone label. And I thought, well, I guess that's the way things are done in the UK. Many, many years later, I'm at a Beatles convention, and I was talking about it to a record dealer, and he said, oh, no, that came out on Apple in the UK. Yeah, so if it's on Parlophone, it's a reissue from later on. I said, I bought it in 1970. Oh, you must have confused it and got it. I said, no, I bought it in 1970. That's the way it is, period. And another record dealer there tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, Bruce, is the prefix on the album with one P or two Ps? I said, how the hell do I know? He said, go home and check it and give me a call, because if what you say is true, I've got good news for you. I go back, I call him up, double P prefix. He says, Bruce, you have the rare export edition. It's worth about $2,000.
Yeah.
So I tell my parents that, and they say, so what, you paid 10 for it, it's now worth 2,000, are you going to sell it? I said, of course I'm not going to sell it. But anyway, so that I, by sheer luck, happened to get an export edition because, they probably made more than they sold, and it happened to be in a shop in London in the summer.
Now, those export editions, those would go overseas to like army bases?
U.S. military bases.
Okay. Primarily. So your record remains in good shape, but you read your book till it fell to pieces, yeah?
Whether you read it or not, it was just going to fall. Particularly with the humidity of New Orleans, it didn't stand a prayer.
Were all the books around the world fairly similar? Was that yes. Packaging kind of the same? Okay, there wasn't a variation for.
No, they're different. I think they pretty much were all printed in the UK and sent to different markets. I may be wrong on that, but I know that all the ones that I've seen have been printed in the UK.
Okay. And from what I understand, in 1976, it was discovered about 500,000 copies of the original Let It Be press were discovered in a warehouse and then sold to various record surplus shops. Are you aware of that?
Are we talking about the album or the booklets?
The album.
That was counterfeited.
Okay.
What happened? Those were counterfeits.
Those were those quantities. I thought they were overstock.
United Artists was the distributor. And United Artists, at some point in time, decided that they were going to delete several albums from their catalog, including the soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night and the soundtrack, so-called soundtrack album to Let It Be. Mm-hmm. Bootleggers moved in to fill the void. And therefore, there are warehouses full, I guess, of bootleg Let It Be albums. And you can recognize them by the covers look pretty, shoddy pictures, and the labels look out of focus, and they don't quite sound as nice. And people will swear that they're the originals because the trail off areas have a Bell Sound Studio stamp in it. So what? They're fake. They're counterfeit. Period. End of story. I'm not aware of a large quantity being found in a warehouse. It's possible there was a quantity found, but, I'm not aware of that story. I know the bulk of the albums that appeared in the mid-'70s were counterfeit. Mm-hmm. And then Capitol bought United Artists Records, at which point in time they put it back in the catalog.
Up to Let It Be, Beatles were pretty involved in the artwork around their records, the covers, just the whole experience of opening the physical good.
They were here too.
For Let It Be, they were across that?
Absolutely. Look, the original cover for the Get Back album, and when you buy the box set, you actually see the original cover. Mm-hmm. The idea was to mimic the Please Please Me album cover. Please Please Me with Love Me Do and 12 other songs. And so, Get Back with Don't Let Me Down and 12 other songs. And it had liner notes on the back written by Tony Barrow that quoted extensively from the liner notes he did for the Please Please Me album, and he added a paragraph or two. So very cool. That's one of the things I love about the vinyl box set is you get that nice big cover. Mm-hmm. So the vinyl box set, if you're into vinyl, it's well worth the, and imagine a lot of your people are going to be into vinyl. It's well worth the extra money. The book it comes with is larger and looks better, and the vinyl is really nice, and the jackets are really nice. So anyway, why didn't they use that album cover? Well, because the picture of the Beatles in the stairwell, had nothing to do with the movie. It was a film soundtrack. So therefore, they went with the images that were used for the Let It Be picture sleeve, which were also the images, the 4 photos that were used on the Get Back book that had been planned. So that's why that was used. The Beatles were well aware of that image.
Were they involved at all in the contributions of the book, or were they just shown things and approved them? Do we know what their involvement was?
I'm sure they saw it. And there were 2 writers that had done the text and submitted it. And it was edited down to a certain extent because it was a little bit, it did not present the Beatles necessarily in a favorable light. Mm-hmm. It was a little bit more colorful. And EMI had concerns about it, and it was kind of watered down.
That Get Back artwork, again, I've got the vinyl set. I absolutely love. I think it's an amazing thing. Holding it in your hands. Was that actually mock-ups created and everything, or is that just now a modern assembly of what the vision was?
The Get Back book?
No, the Get Back cover. For example, they've got that stairwell picture on the back. They've got the writing.
Now, that was what was going to come out had the album been released in 1969. That would have been the cover and the liner notes.
Yeah. Did they go so far as to mock that up, or is that a modern assembly of what the idea was?
Well, I know that they definitely did a mock-up for the revised album jacket, because I've seen that mock-up and it went in auction. So this may have, I don't know how far along it was taken. In other words, I'm sure that they had something lined up, whether or not they actually physically made any covers. They probably didn't. Mm-hmm. But the artwork may have been done back in 69.
Okay. So for this new Let It Be Super Deluxe box set, it's absolutely gorgeous. Let's be somewhat devil's advocate here. Anywhere you think it falls short, something you would have liked to seen in that box set that isn't there?
More music.
More music? Okay.
In other words, look, obviously it wasn't going to have 83 discs worth of music. Mm-hmm. But there were some really, I think, additional Twickenham recordings and additional Apple recordings I would have included. Now, I understand what they're trying to do is put together a listening experience that the average fan will love and enjoy and not get bored with. I think they could have included more. But when I reviewed the box set for my website, Beatle.net, and for Beatle Fan Magazine, I reviewed the product that they released. The product that they released is fabulous. And, what would I give it if I were grading it? An A minus rather than an A, simply because I would have had more on it. Anyone who buys it should not be disappointed with what they're getting. If you want more, you can listen to the bootlegs. One day, I hope that more of this material is made available, through Apple in higher quality. That may or may not ever happen. But, as far as what they gave you, it's great. The book that comes with it is fabulous, as is the standalone Get Back book, which is also available, as is my book, which is not an official Apple product. Nonetheless, I hope people enjoy it and buy it.
Your books are always wonderful, and I think this is a great time to be able to make sure people know about Beatle.net.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Pretty much anything that Bruce puts out there is targeted directly to us music nerds and record collectors. And the Beatles Finally Let It Be is absolutely right there. There are hard copies available at Beatle.net. I tend to get the digital copies because I get them right away, and
right.
I look at them on
be ordered.
Yeah, I look at them on my iPad, and they can also be updated. From what I understand,
yes.
Every so often there are revisions. So
we certainly would be doing that. And the Beatles Finally Let It Be also, as do all the books in the album series. I've done a whole series of books, starting with Sgt. Pepper, moving forward, and then my most recent book covers Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. So that book is out now as well through Beatle.net. I also do what are called collector's editions, which are signed and numbered. So on this one, limited to 500. And they also come with extra goodies such as posters and bookmarks. And in the case of the Let It Be book, an Eric Cash illustration of the rooftop concert, which is not in the book and which is really cool. So, I think people, check out the collector's editions. I know a lot of your listeners are collectors, and they're reasonably priced at $100. Collector's edition books are normally priced a lot more than that. So, they come in a case, and we try to give people good value for their money, which is what the Beatles were always about. Give people good value for their money.
Mm-hmm. I'd even recommend people go back to getting copies of the Beatles on VJ, Beatles on Capitol, Apple, the international ones. I've got them all, and they're great reference books, especially if you're out there. You find a record out in the wild. You want to know what it is. Is it, that $5 price tag on it? Is it a hidden gem? You could very easily pull up one of Bruce's books and kind of figure out if that's something that is different than you already have at home. So with this reissue and box set, do you know of anything the Beatles recorded or created during the Let It Be sessions that wasn't able to be found?
Not for this. You have all the Nagra reels, which are not every note that was recorded because they have very short time frame, but they had two cameras and two reels rolling. So for that reason, pretty much everything is on those reels. At Apple, obviously, there's a lot more on the Nagra reels than what was actually recorded, although in keeping with the concept, a lot more studio banter was recorded than for a normal session. And Giles Martin and Sam O'Kell took advantage of that by giving us a lot of that studio banter in the Let It Be box set. One of the things that I would have liked to have heard that I think exists, but I can't be sure because I haven't heard it, but it's my understanding that on the 8-track, there was a version of Bye Bye Love done by the Beatles, or shall I say by John and Paul. The problem with that version is when you listen to it on the Nagra reel in mono, George and Ringo are practicing the song Two of Us simultaneously with John and Paul just knocking out this fun little song. On the 8-track, if that is the case, I believe you could isolate John and Paul's acoustic guitars and vocals doing Bye Bye Love. And to me, that would probably sound incredible. And yeah, I view that as a missed opportunity if that is the case. But once again, I emphasize, don't get hung up on what isn't on this box set. Listen and enjoy what is included.
So we're all excited about this Peter Jackson documentary.
Are we ever?
Have you had any advanced access or information or even a viewing of this as of this time?
I have not had an advance. I've seen what everyone else has seen. What I am hoping is, with its expanded time, that Peter Jackson will include a lot more music. And I think he will. There will be, of course, discussions and the like, and them goofing around. But I think, and I think this is something that Giles Martin recognized, and something that I recognized a long time ago as well. When I saw the film Let It Be, to me, one of the really fun moments was the Beatles grinning their way through You Really Got a Hold on Me. And when I heard it on a bootleg, even though it was high quality, it was painful to listen to. So a lot of those rock and roll performances that ain't that great to listen to might be really fun to watch. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that's the case. And so what I'm looking forward to is how much did Peter Jackson include of the Beatles working their way through some of these songs, and us really enjoying seeing them doing these rock and roll chestnuts from their old days. Because as hard to listen to as they may be, they're probably going to be a real gas to watch them perform.
Before Peter Jackson got involved, were there attempts in the last several decades to revisit the Get Back movie with all that raw material?
I don't think there were any serious attempts to. I know I always felt very strongly that if someone re-edited that film, it could be a really upbeat, fun experience. And the rushes of the previews and the trailer we've seen, boy, it's going to be fun and upbeat. That said, knowing Peter Jackson, I do not see Peter Jackson doing a whitewash. I do believe and hope we will see George quit the group if that's on film, and it should be. And I do believe we will see the discussions of, when George left. And I'm hoping we'll even get a little bit of the Beatles doing an incredibly horrendous version of Don't Let Me Down with John and Yoko and Paul and Ringo, no George. Because I think it was it certainly happened, and I think a little bit of it would be an honest representation of what was going on. I do not think Peter Jackson will whitewash this. I think he will show a lot of fun and a lot of great stuff, and that's fine, because that definitely happened. It's not like he got the Beatles back together again and they went on a sound stage and reshot stuff. We're going to get only things that really happened during that filming. And I do believe there will be the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Is everything that's on the Nagra reels on film as well? Could they
theoretically, yes.
Assume it? Oh, okay.
Theoretically, yes. Is it? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. That's why I think there should be film of George quitting the group. Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't exist. But if it does, be kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I know I'm getting Disney Plus specifically for that.
I had Disney Plus before, but if I hadn't, I would have definitely got it. Look, Peter Jackson, the trailer and the preview we've seen show what I suspected. And that was after I saw what he did with out of sync, century-old film from World War I, black and white, and turned that into glorious color. I thought, my goodness, what he's going to do with 50-year-old 16 millimeter film, This will be a piece of cake. And it is fabulous.
Do we know the history of those Let It Be reels? Like after 1970, they got stored somewhere. Do we know where they went? Is there a story or a tale that goes along with those?
I'm sure there is, but I do not know who had physical possession of them. Whether the Beatles had physical possession of the reels, or whether, United Artists, although I don't know why they would, whether Michael Lindsay Hogg, I don't know where they were. All I know is I'm glad they were not at any location that suffered a fire.
Right. Like so many other master tapes. I also heard recently, this just came out in this last week, back to the reissue, the box set, the Japan issue of Let It Be Super Deluxe had a different and possibly originally correct Glenn Johns mix, where the rest of the world used a master from amalgamated sources. Are you aware of that?
I don't know, since I haven't given it an exact play-by-play to see if that indeed is the case. I think that the issue might have been on I Mean Mine, perhaps. That issue, which was on the bonus disc, but not on the album itself. There might have been one other, but unless I really A/B the two of them, I really couldn't tell you.
Got it.
But it may be that people will say, "Oh my goodness, I need to get the Japanese edition," which of course is going to be very expensive.
Absolutely. Well, this box set is, again, it's allowed me to revisit this album that I've never really paid as much attention to as the rest of the Beatles catalog. But
same here. I'm gonna admit that too. And look, I think Giles and Sam O'Kell did a wonderful job on the remix. And look, I'm still not convinced the Beatles ever really nailed this thing, but this is about as close to it as we're going to get. And what I mean by that is that the Get Back album itself that Glenn Johns did, to me, wasn't what it could have been because of this questionable selection of some of the takes.
Mm-hmm.
Phil Spector, because of what he did to some of the songs. We have a DY, you could do it yourself from Anthology, but those weren't necessarily the best. Let It Be Naked, I was really surprised. I loved the album when it came out. It sounded great. And when I did the book, The Beatles Finally Let It Be, and I re-listened to the album, it had no soul. It was fine, but it didn't have soul. The other ones had soul because they had the studio banter and the fun stuff. And so my feeling was they never really got it right. This box set comes pretty darn close.
Yeah.
In that we get the Glenn John mix, we get the Phil Spector. And look, bear in mind what Giles's job was. It wasn't to do another Let It Be Naked. It was to take what Phil Spector did and make it sound better and more contemporary. And on that level, he succeeded fabulously. If you listen to Across the Universe, the choir and the strings are not muddy sounding. They sound clear and distinct. The instruments, the strings sound like an instrument all on its own, and they work fine. Let It Be is much improved, although I might have toned it down even more than Giles did. Long and Winding Road, that damn harp at the end's not as annoying for some reason.
Yeah.
So, his mission was, to take what Spector did and make it sound more contemporary. He did not deconstruct the wall of sound completely, and nor should he have, I guess, for that purpose.
Right. He kept it authentic, but much more palatable.
I know some people that tell me now it's, one of their favorite albums, where before it wasn't in their top 10.
Well, look, Bruce, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's always a joy to have you on. And I do want to have you back on at some point to talk about Magical Mystery Tour and the Christmas albums. I'd love to have a conversation on those at some point.
I'd love to do it. The Christmas albums, the Christmas album and the discs, really there's a lot more to them than people think. And I devoted a full chapter to them in both the Parlophone book and the Apple book. And those who, the Apple book is sold out, the Parlophone book is not. For those of you, if you get the Parlophone book, be sure to read the chapter on the Christmas album, because there's a lot more to these recordings than meets the ear. And with that teaser, we'll set it up for a future show. I'd love to come back and talk about Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine and the Christmas albums as well. So you got me for 2 more shows.
It would be our pleasure. Bruce, thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Cheers. There we go, Mr. Bruce Spizer. Again, check out Bruce's books at Beatle.net. The Beatles Finally Let It Be is one of his more recent ones, but there's a ton of others as well. I collect them all. I enjoy them all. Digital copies, hard copies, physical copies, collectible copies, all available at Beatle.net. And that's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Thanks again for listening. By the way, if you are interested in helping support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/vinylguide. Up at patreon.com/vinylguide, we put all sorts of extra stuff. We have extended interviews, secret episodes, early access to interviews, and heaps more. All for supporting the show, plus you get the warm, fuzzy feeling that you're helping make this happen. That's patreon.com/vinylguide. Thanks in advance for your support, and we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, get out there and buy some records, people. Cheers.
That's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Send your thoughts to Nate at thevinylguide.com or follow or tag us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide. Until next time, keep spinning.